Sheriff Daniel Hawkins shot my pregnant wife 7 times in our kitchen while I watched through our security camera from 200 miles away. 3 bullets to her chest, 2 to her abdomen where our unborn daughter was growing, and 2 more as she tried to crawl toward the phone to call for help. He thought he was eliminating a witness to his drug trafficking operation, covering his tracks before anyone could connect him to the cartel money flowing through our county. What Sheriff Hawkins didn't know was that the woman he just murdered was married to a Delta Force operator who'd spent 12 years eliminating targets the government couldn't touch through legal channels, and I just watched every second of her death on live feed. The notification came through on my phone at exactly 3:47 p.m. while I was sitting in a briefing room at Fort Bragg reviewing operational plans for a mission in Yemen. Motion detected in kitchen, the home security app announced with the cheerful tone of technology that doesn't understand context. I almost ignored it because Sarah was 7 months pregnant and constantly moving around the house, but something made me open the live feed anyway. That decision gave me 30 seconds to watch my wife die and no way to stop it. Sarah was standing at the kitchen sink washing vegetables for dinner when Sheriff Hawkins walked through our back door without knocking. I could see the surprise on her face as she turned around, still holding a carrot and the vegetable peeler. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" Her voice came through clearly on the audio feed. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow for the deposition." Hawkins looked different from the professional lawman I'd known for 3 years since we moved to Millerton County. His uniform was disheveled, his face was pale and sweating despite the cool October weather, and his hand was resting on his service weapon with the casual readiness of someone preparing to use it. "Sarah, I'm sorry," Hawkins said, and those 3 words told me everything I needed to know about what was coming next. "You saw something you shouldn't have seen, and I can't let you testify about what you found in those evidence files." My wife's face went from confused to terrified in the space between heartbeats. She took a step backward, her hands instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly where our daughter had been kicking that morning during breakfast. "Daniel, please, whatever this is about, we can talk about it." "I won't say anything. I promise. We can figure this out." But Hawkins was already drawing his weapon, and I was 200 miles away watching through a security camera with no way to intervene, no way to protect my family, no way to do anything except bear witness to murder. The first shot hit Sarah in the chest and she went down hard, her head cracking against the tile floor. The second and third shots followed immediately, professional grouping, center mass, exactly the kind of shooting that law enforcement trains for. But Hawkins didn't stop there. He walked closer and fired 2 more shots into her abdomen, deliberately targeting our unborn child. Then 2 more into her chest as she tried to crawl toward the phone on the counter. I watched my wife die for 43 seconds before her body stopped moving. Hawkins stood over her for another 20 seconds, checking her pulse with the clinical detachment of someone confirming a job completed. Then he holstered his weapon, pulled out his radio, and made a call that I would hear repeated over and over in my nightmares for the rest of my life. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Hawkins. I need backup and an ambulance at 1247 Oakwood Drive." Shots fired. 1 civilian down. Appears to be a home invasion gone wrong. The briefing room at Fort Bragg disappeared around me as shock and rage competed for control of my nervous system. Someone was asking me a question about the Yemen operation, but I couldn't hear them because all I could hear was Sarah's last scream, cut short by bullets tearing through her lungs. My hands were shaking as I stood up from the conference table, and Colonel Marcus Reeves, my commanding officer, immediately recognized that something catastrophic had just happened. "Connor, what's wrong? Talk to me." "My wife," I managed to say through a throat that felt like it was closing. "Sheriff Hawkins just murdered my wife and my unborn daughter. I watched it happen on our security camera. He shot her 7 times and then called it in as a home invasion." The room went completely silent as 8 Delta Force operators processed what I'd just said. These were men who'd seen every kind of horror that warfare produces, but the murder of a pregnant woman by a law enforcement officer in a small American town was somehow more shocking than anything we'd faced overseas. Colonel Reeves moved fast, making decisions with the kind of calm efficiency that had kept him alive through 25 years of special operations. "Connor, I'm granting you emergency leave effective immediately. I'll have a helicopter ready to take you to Millerton in 30 minutes. Do you need anyone to accompany you? I need access to my personal weapons locker and permission to handle this situation using whatever methods are necessary." The colonel met my eyes and I could see him making calculations about legal liability, military regulations, and the practical reality that one of his best operators had just watched his family murdered by a corrupt sheriff. "Officially, I'm ordering you to cooperate fully with local law enforcement and let the justice system handle this situation." Reeves paused, then added quietly, "Unofficially, I didn't hear anything you just said about weapons or methods." You're on emergency leave for family tragedy. What you do during that leave is between you and God. 35 minutes later, I was in a Black Hawk helicopter flying toward Millerton County with a duffel bag containing enough weapons and equipment to wage a small war. The other operators had contributed items from their own personal caches, untraceable weapons, encrypted communication devices, even C4 explosives with electric detonators. No one said anything about why they were giving me these items, but the message was clear. We take care of our own, and anyone who murders a soldier's family has declared war on all of us. The flight gave me time to review the security footage again, this time with the clinical detachment I'd been trained to apply to mission planning. I watched Hawkins murder Sarah 7 more times, noting every detail. The way he'd walked through the back door without hesitation meant he had keys or knew the door would be unlocked. The professional shooting pattern meant this wasn't an emotional crime, it was an execution. The deliberate shots to Sarah's abdomen meant he specifically wanted to kill our unborn child. And the fake 911 call meant he'd been planning this cover story before he arrived. But the most important detail was something Hawkins had said before pulling his weapon. Sarah had seen something in evidence files, something damaging enough that Hawkins was willing to commit murder to prevent her from testifying. My wife worked as a paralegal for the county prosecutor's office, handling case files and preparing evidence for trial. She'd been working on a drug trafficking case involving cartel operations in Southern California, and 3 days ago she called me at Fort Bragg, excited about discovering discrepancies in the evidence logs that suggested someone in law enforcement was stealing seized drugs and money. I found something big, she'd said, her voice carrying the enthusiasm she always had when solving complex problems. Someone's been tampering with evidence in the Martinez case. Drugs and cash are disappearing from the evidence room, and the logs have been altered to hide it. I'm going to tell the prosecutor tomorrow and recommend a full audit. I told her to be careful, to make copies of everything, to not trust anyone until she knew who was involved in the corruption. But I hadn't considered that the person stealing evidence might be the sheriff himself, that the threat would come from the one person everyone in the county trusted to protect them. The helicopter touched down in an empty field 3 miles from Millerton at exactly 6:15 p.m., 2.5 hours after Sarah's murder. I could see police lights in the distance, emergency vehicles surrounding our house where my wife's body was still lying on the kitchen floor. But I didn't go to the house because that would mean confronting Hawkins before I understood the full scope of his operation, and premature confrontation would alert him that his cover story was compromised. Instead, I hiked through the woods to a hunting cabin I'd purchased 2 years earlier, a remote location where I could establish a base of operations without anyone knowing I was in the county. The cabin had everything I needed: generator power, satellite internet, and enough isolation that I could conduct surveillance and planning without interruption. I set up my equipment and started pulling together intelligence on Sheriff Daniel Hawkins using databases I still had access to through my military connections. What I found was a textbook case of corruption hiding in plain sight. Hawkins had been sheriff of Millerton County for 12 years, elected 4 times with overwhelming support from voters who saw him as a crusader against drug trafficking. His department had one of the highest drug seizure rates in California, making national news for major busts that supposedly disrupted cartel operations. But when I dug deeper into the evidence records that Sarah had been reviewing, a pattern emerged that explained everything. Hawkins would make high-profile drug busts, seize large quantities of cocaine or methamphetamine along with cash, then only a fraction of the seized items would make it to trial. The rest disappeared from the evidence room with falsified paperwork suggesting it had been destroyed or transferred to federal agencies. Over 12 years, Hawkins had stolen approximately $40 million in drugs and cash from his own evidence room, reselling the drugs back to the same cartels he claimed to be fighting. Sarah had discovered this pattern 3 days before her murder and had been preparing to present her findings to the county prosecutor. But someone had warned Hawkins, probably one of his deputies who was also involved in the corruption, and he'd made the decision to eliminate the threat before Sarah could expose his operation. The home invasion story was his cover, a narrative that would be accepted without question because everyone trusted the sheriff and no one would suspect him of murdering a pregnant woman in cold blood. I spent the next 6 hours building a complete intelligence profile on Hawkins and his organization. He had 23 deputies in his department, but only 5 were involved in the evidence theft, all veterans who'd served in Iraq or Afghanistan and understood operational security. The rest of the department was clean, good cops who genuinely believed they were serving justice under a heroic sheriff. Hawkins's inner circle met regularly at a bar called the Depot, ostensibly for after-hours social gatherings but actually to coordinate their criminal operations and divide profits from drug sales. But the most valuable intelligence came from Hawkins's own security cameras, which I was able to access remotely using techniques Delta Force had taught me for compromising enemy surveillance systems. The footage showed Hawkins returning to the sheriff's office at 4:30 p.m., exactly 43 minutes after murdering Sarah, and meeting with his 5 corrupt deputies in a conference room. I couldn't hear the audio, but their body language suggested they were discussing the murder and making sure their stories aligned for the inevitable investigation. At 11 p.m., I received a call from Colonel Reeves on my encrypted satellite phone. "Connor, I'm sorry for your loss. How are you holding up?" "I'm functional, sir. Gathering intelligence on Hawkins and his operation. The situation is worse than I initially thought. He's been running a drug theft ring for 12 years, stealing from his own evidence room and reselling to cartels." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "What's your plan?" "Systematic dismantling, sir. I'm going to expose his corruption, destroy his organization, and make sure he faces justice for Sarah's murder. But I need to do it carefully because if I move too fast, his political connections might allow him to escape prosecution." "Do you need support? Extraction? Additional operators?" "Not yet, sir. This is something I need to handle personally. But if things go wrong, if Hawkins's connections reach higher than local law enforcement, I might need help cutting through federal bureaucracy." "You have my direct number," Reeves said. "Call anytime, day or night. And Connor, for what it's worth, every operator in Delta sends their condolences. Sarah was family to all of us." The line went dead and I sat in the darkness of the cabin thinking about the last conversation I'd had with Sarah before leaving for Fort Bragg 3 weeks earlier. She'd been folding laundry in our bedroom, her pregnant belly making it difficult to reach the basket, and I'd offered to help. "David," she'd said, using my first name instead of the various nicknames she usually preferred, "promise me something. If anything ever happens to me, promise you won't do anything stupid. Don't throw your life away for revenge." I'd laughed and told her nothing was going to happen, that Millerton was the safest place we'd ever lived. But she'd been serious, making me promise that I'd focus on building a good life instead of destroying the people who hurt me. I'd made that promise 3 weeks ago, and now I was breaking it because some promises become impossible to keep when the person you made them to is murdered. The next morning, I attended Sarah's crime scene as David Connor, grieving husband and military officer on emergency leave, playing the role of devastated civilian while carefully observing everything Hawkins and his deputies said. The house was still surrounded by police tape, and Hawkins was standing in the driveway giving a statement to news cameras about the tragic home invasion that had claimed 2 innocent lives. He looked appropriately somber, hitting all the right notes about justice and finding the perpetrators, and if I hadn't watched him murder my wife, I would have believed his performance completely. "Mr. Connor," Hawkins said when he saw me approaching, his face arranging itself into an expression of sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm so sorry for your loss. We're doing everything possible to find the people responsible for this tragedy." I studied him for a long moment, letting him see the raw grief of a husband who'd lost everything but not yet showing him the operator who was planning his destruction. "Sheriff, my wife called me 3 days ago, excited about some discrepancies she'd found in evidence files for the Martinez drug case. Do you know anything about that?" Hawkins's expression didn't change, but I saw a microscopic tension in his jaw that confirmed Sarah's discovery had been the motive for her murder. "I'm not familiar with the specifics of Mrs. Connor's casework, but I can have someone from the prosecutor's office brief you if you'd like." "That won't be necessary," I said quietly. "I'm sure everything will become clear during the investigation." We held eye contact for exactly 3 seconds, and I could see him trying to assess whether I suspected anything or was just a grieving husband asking random questions. He concluded I was harmless, just another civilian who would accept the official narrative and never think to question the sheriff's integrity. That mistake would cost him everything. Over the next week, I played the role of devastated widower while secretly conducting 24-hour surveillance on Hawkins and his corrupt deputies. I attended Sarah's funeral with appropriate grief, accepted condolences from neighbors who'd known us for 3 years, and gave interviews to local media about what a wonderful person my wife had been. But every night I returned to the hunting cabin and analyzed the intelligence I was gathering on Hawkins's criminal organization, building a case that would destroy him legally and personally. The break I needed came from an unexpected source. Lisa Martinez, the deputy prosecutor who'd been working with Sarah on the drug trafficking case, called my cell phone 8 days after the murder. "Mr. Connor, I know this is a difficult time, but I need to talk to you about something Sarah discovered before she died. Can we meet somewhere private?" We met at a coffee shop in the next county over, far enough from Millerton that Hawkins's surveillance network wouldn't notice. Lisa was young, maybe 30, with the determined expression of someone who'd chosen prosecution work because she genuinely believed in justice rather than career advancement. Sarah found evidence that someone in law enforcement has been stealing drugs and money from the evidence room for years, Lisa said quietly, sliding a folder across the table. She made copies of everything before someone could destroy the originals. I've been reviewing her findings, and Mr. Connor, this goes all the way to the top. Sheriff Hawkins is running a criminal enterprise bigger than most of the cartels we prosecute. I opened the folder and saw copies of evidence logs, financial records, surveillance footage, and detailed notes in Sarah's handwriting documenting years of systematic theft. My wife had built an airtight case against Hawkins, complete with enough evidence to guarantee federal prosecution. But she'd been murdered before she could present her findings, and now Lisa was the only person besides me who knew the truth. Why are you showing me this instead of taking it to the FBI? Because I don't know who to trust, Lisa said, her voice shaking slightly. Hawkins has connections everywhere, federal agencies, state government, even the governor's office. If I go through official channels, someone might warn him before arrests can be made. But you're military, special operations, according to Sarah. You have resources outside the normal system. I studied the young prosecutor across the table and made a decision that would determine whether Sarah's murder resulted in justice or just more corruption hiding behind badges. I need you to do exactly what I tell you, exactly when I tell you, with no questions asked. Can you do that? Lisa nodded without hesitation. What do you need? I need you to request a meeting with Hawkins in 3 days. Tell him you want to discuss Sarah's casework and tie up loose ends. Act nervous, like you suspect something but aren't sure what. Make him think you're a threat that needs to be eliminated. You want me to make myself a target? I want Hawkins to panic and make mistakes. When criminals get scared, they either run or try to eliminate threats. Either response will give me the opening I need to destroy his organization completely. 3 days later, Lisa had her meeting with Hawkins exactly as planned. I was positioned in a surveillance van 3 blocks from the sheriff's office, monitoring their conversation through a wire Lisa was wearing under her blouse. The audio quality was perfect, and I could hear every word as Lisa nervously explained that she was reviewing Sarah's case files and had some questions about evidence handling procedures. Hawkins played his role perfectly, concerned sheriff helping a young prosecutor understand complex procedures, but I could hear the calculation in his voice as he assessed the threat Lisa represented. After the meeting, I followed Hawkins as he drove to the depot bar where his corrupt deputies were waiting. The conversation I recorded over the next hour provided everything I needed to bring down his entire organization. Hawkins ordered 2 of his deputies to eliminate Lisa Martinez the same way they'd eliminated Sarah Connor, make it look like an accident or random crime, and do it within 48 hours. He also discussed moving their stolen drug inventory to a new location because federal heat was increasing after Sarah's high-profile murder. But most damning was Hawkins's casual admission that he'd personally shot Sarah 7 times because she'd been too dangerous to let live. I sent copies of that recording to 3 different locations: FBI field office in Los Angeles, Department of Justice in Washington, and an investigative journalist at the Los Angeles Times who specialized in law enforcement corruption. Then I made a phone call to Colonel Reeves on my encrypted satellite phone. Sir, I need to request official support for a situation that's escalated beyond what one operator can handle alone. Reeves didn't hesitate. What do you need? Federal law enforcement coordination, protection for a witness who's being targeted for murder, and legal authority to conduct arrests if necessary. Hawkins is planning to kill another prosecutor within 48 hours, and I can't stop that and dismantle his organization simultaneously. Within 6 hours, an FBI tactical team was positioned in Millerton County under the guise of investigating drug trafficking, but their real mission was protecting Lisa Martinez and preparing to arrest Hawkins and his deputies. I coordinated with the FBI team leader, a veteran agent named Sarah Chin who understood that sometimes justice requires unconventional methods. Your recordings are enough for arrest warrants, Chin said as we reviewed the evidence in a secure location. But we need to move fast before Hawkins realizes he's compromised. Tonight, I said. Hawkins is meeting with his deputies at the depot at 10 p.m. to finalize plans for killing Lisa. That's when you take them all down simultaneously. The operation went exactly as planned. At 10:07 p.m., FBI tactical teams hit the depot with overwhelming force, catching Hawkins and his 5 corrupt deputies in the middle of discussing murder for hire while I watched from a surveillance position across the street. The look on Hawkins's face when he realized he was being arrested was worth every sleepless night I'd spent building the case against him. His expression shifted from shock to calculation to the desperate fear of someone whose carefully constructed criminal empire was collapsing in real time. But I wasn't finished with Daniel Hawkins yet, because arrest and prosecution wouldn't be enough to balance the scales for Sarah's murder. He needed to understand on a personal level what it felt like to lose everything you love while being completely powerless to stop it. Over the next 3 months while Hawkins sat in federal custody awaiting trial, I systematically destroyed every aspect of his life that mattered. His wife divorced him after learning about his decades of corruption and the murder of a pregnant woman. His children changed their last names and moved out of state to escape the shame of their father's crimes. His reputation as a crusading sheriff was replaced by national media coverage exposing him as one of the most corrupt law enforcement officers in California history. The trial lasted 6 weeks and resulted in guilty verdicts on 47 counts including murder, racketeering, drug trafficking, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. The federal prosecutor presented overwhelming evidence including my recordings, Sarah's documented findings, and testimony from deputies who'd taken plea deals in exchange for cooperation. Hawkins's defense team tried every legal maneuver available, but there was no defending against video evidence, audio recordings, and the testimony of his own former colleagues. When the judge handed down the sentence, life in federal prison without possibility of parole, I was sitting in the courtroom watching Hawkins's face as he realized he'd spend the rest of his life in a cage surrounded by the same criminals he'd claimed to be fighting. But the judge added something that made the 14 months since Sarah's murder feel like they'd finally reached a meaningful conclusion. Sheriff Hawkins, you abused the public trust in the most egregious manner possible. You murdered a pregnant woman to hide your corruption, then used your badge to cover up your crime. Your sentence reflects not just the crimes you committed, but the betrayal of every citizen who trusted you to protect them. After the trial, I returned to Fort Bragg and requested assignment to the most dangerous operations Delta Force was running, missions in Syria, Yemen, Somalia, anywhere I could channel the rage that still burned whenever I thought about Sarah dying on our kitchen floor. Colonel Reeves tried to convince me to take time to process the trauma, but processing meant thinking about what I'd lost, and thinking about that loss would make it impossible to function. So I deployed continuously for the next 3 years, earning a reputation as the operator who volunteered for missions that other soldiers considered suicide. It wasn't until 5 years after Sarah's death that I finally accepted that revenge and justice, while satisfying, hadn't healed the fundamental wound of losing my wife and daughter. I was standing in a village in Afghanistan that had just been liberated from Taliban control, watching children play in streets that had been war zones 48 hours earlier, when I realized that Sarah would have wanted me to focus on protecting the innocent rather than destroying the guilty. She'd made me promise not to throw my life away on revenge, and while I'd broken that promise in the short term, I could honor it in the long term by choosing purpose over pain. I retired from Delta Force at 38 years old with enough commendations to fill a wall and enough nightmares to fill a lifetime. But instead of disappearing into the veteran community, I started a foundation called Sarah's Promise, dedicated to protecting witnesses in corruption cases and ensuring that prosecutors like Lisa Martinez had the resources to fight powerful criminals without becoming targets themselves. The foundation provided security, legal support, and safe houses for people brave enough to stand against corruption, and over 10 years we helped convict 47 corrupt officials across 12 states. Daniel Hawkins died in federal prison 7 years after his conviction, killed by members of a drug cartel who'd never forgiven him for stealing their product and reselling it for personal profit. I didn't celebrate his death because that would have required caring about him as a person, and he'd stopped being a person to me the moment he murdered Sarah. He was just a problem I'd solved, a threat I'd eliminated, a cautionary tale about what happens when corrupt officials believe themselves untouchable. 15 years after Sarah's death, I remarried to a woman named Jennifer who understood that some wounds never fully heal but can be transformed into purpose. We had 2 daughters, Emma and Sarah, named for the family I'd lost and the future I was building. On the anniversary of Sarah's murder, I visited her grave with flowers and our daughters, teaching them about the mother they never met who'd been brave enough to stand against corruption even when it cost her everything. The story of Sheriff Daniel Hawkins became a case study in law enforcement academies across the country, a warning about how power corrupts and how even trusted officials can become the monsters they're supposed to fight. But more importantly, Sarah's documentation of his crimes inspired new protocols for evidence handling and oversight, reducing opportunities for corruption in sheriff's departments nationwide. My wife's murder had exposed a weakness in the system, and her legacy was the reforms that prevented others from exploiting that weakness. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories of justice and redemption. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from around the world, and let me know what kind of stories you want to hear next. Remember that corruption only thrives when good people stay silent, and sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to accept that evil can hide behind a badge. Sarah Connor chose truth over safety, and that choice changed an entire system. Until next time, stay strong and never stop fighting for what's right. The end.